Get the hell out." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Vanessa Cole pointed toward the door, with the kind of certainty that came from never being wrong or never being questioned. The man standing in front of her wore a faded jacket, scuffed boots, and carried a single worn duffel bag. He looked like he'd walked into the wrong terminal, the wrong world. The other passengers in the private lounge glanced over and quietly agreed. Then, from the tarmac outside, a jet engine roared to life, and the white aircraft rolling to a stop was there for him. Marcus Hale had not slept in 31 hours. Not because he couldn't, but because there hadn't been a reason to stop. The briefing documents from the International Health Response Coalition had come through at 2 in the morning, a cluster of severe fever cases in a mountain region, source unknown, spreading faster than the local clinics could manage. By 3, he had already confirmed his availability. By 5, he was packed. The bag he carried was the same one he had used for the past 11 years, a worn black duffel with a broken zipper pull he'd replaced with a carabiner clip. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, which was the only standard he applied to most things in his life. He had spent those 11 years moving between places that rarely appeared on travel itineraries, rural field hospitals, temporary quarantine zones, regions where the infrastructure had collapsed, faster than the disease response could catch up. Infectious disease wasn't a specialty people chose for comfort or recognition. It was the kind of work that found you usually after you'd already decided that the cleaner, quieter version of medicine wasn't enough. For Marcus, that decision had come early and had never reversed itself. He wasn't built for the predictable rhythms of a clinic schedule, the same waiting room, the same paperwork cycle. He needed the uncertainty. He needed to be somewhere that genuinely required him. That afternoon, the organization had arranged a private charter to get him there. The outbreak region wasn't accessible by commercial flight. The nearest major airport was hours from the site, and time was the one variable they could not afford to waste. A charter company had been contracted, the booking confirmed, and Marcus had received the flight details by email that morning. He'd read it once, forwarded it to his contact at the coalition, and gotten in a cab to the private terminal on the eastern edge of the airport. He had never used a private terminal before. There was no reason he would have. The world he moved in didn't operate from leather lounges and complimentary cocktails. He walked in carrying his duffel, wearing a jacket that had been washed too many times and still smelled faintly of industrial disinfectant from his last assignment. He was looking for the gate agent, a check-in counter, anything that confirmed he was in the right place. The terminal was small, a single lounge, floor-to-ceiling glass facing the tarmac. A handful of people settled into oversized chairs with drinks and luggage that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. Vanessa Cole was standing near the entrance desk when he walked in. She was in her early 30s, sharp-featured with the kind of professional composure that functioned as a wall more than a welcome. She took one look at Marcus, the jacket, the bag, the boots, and her expression didn't shift so much as it locked into place. She moved toward him before he could approach the desk. "Can I help you?" she said, in a tone that made it clear she didn't expect the answer to be yes. Marcus told her he was there for a chartered flight. He gave her his name, explained the booking was arranged through the International Health Response Coalition, and said the departure was scheduled within the hour. Vanessa's expression didn't change. She asked if he had documentation. Marcus reached into the front pocket of his duffel and pulled out his phone. He had the confirmation email open, the booking reference. The tail number of the aircraft, the coalition's contact information, his name listed as sole passenger. He turned the screen toward her. She looked at it the way people look at something they've already decided to disbelieve. A glance, a slight tightening around the eyes, and then she handed the phone back without touching it, as though physical contact with the screen might commit her to taking it seriously. "This terminal is reserved for clients of our contracted carriers," Vanessa said. "I'm going to need you to verify through the main desk outside." Marcus kept his voice even. He told her the booking was through a contracted carrier. The tail number was right there in the confirmation. He told her the flight was time-sensitive, that he wasn't trying to cause a problem, and that if she pulled up the manifest for that aircraft, his name would be on it. Vanessa didn't pull up anything. She crossed her arms slightly, not aggressively, but with the practiced calm of someone who had decided the conversation was over and was simply waiting for the other person to realize it. One of the men seated nearby thick watch open collar, the relaxed posture of someone who considered being in this room a baseline expectation rather than a privilege, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He said something to the woman next to him, too low to fully hear, but the word "lost" was in it. The woman smiled. A few others glanced over registered Marcus and went back to their drinks. Marcus stood where he was. He understood what was happening. It wasn't complicated, and it wasn't new. He had been underestimated in cleaner buildings than this one. What made this particular moment different was the math of it. If he walked out and tried to resolve the situation from the main terminal, the time it would take to reach someone with authority and loop back would push him past the departure window. The charter flight wouldn't wait indefinitely. The coalition had already communicated how urgent the situation on the ground was. Every hour mattered. Every hour of his specifically, because he was the one who had been asked for by name, which meant someone in that mountain region had already decided that getting him there was worth chartering an aircraft to do it. He wasn't going to walk out. He looked at Vanessa and asked her calmly to pull up the manifest for the incoming aircraft. He gave her the tail number from memory. He told her to check it against the booking system, and if his name wasn't there, he would leave without another word. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression, not toward belief, but toward irritation. The kind that comes when a person refuses to behave the way you've already scripted them behaving. She hadn't expected him to stay, and she hadn't expected him to be specific. The tail number was a detail that required her to either act on it or visibly refuse to, and both options cost her something. She said she would need to contact operations, and she said it in a way that made contact operations sound like a thing she would eventually get around to, possibly never. Marcus said that was fine. He told her he would wait right there. The man with the thick watch made the not-quite laugh sound again louder this time. He said to no one in particular that some people just didn't know when they were in the wrong place. A woman near the window agreed. Aloud said it happened all the time, that the open terminal layout made it confusing for people who belonged in the general concourse. She didn't say it to Marcus. She said it about him, which was a different kind of dismissal, the kind that treats the subject as furniture rather than a person. Marcus heard all of it. He didn't respond to any of it. He had stopped measuring his worth against the opinions of strangers in comfortable rooms a long time ago, not because he was above it emotionally. He wasn't, but because he had learned through years of working in places where people were actively dying exactly what indifference looked like when it had real consequences. What was happening in this lounge was noise. What was happening in that mountain region was not. Vanessa stepped away from the desk, speaking quietly into a radio. Marcus set his duffel on the floor beside him and waited. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the tarmac stretched out flat and gray in the late afternoon light. Nothing was moving yet. The aircraft hadn't arrived. The departure window hadn't closed. He waited, and the room continued around him. The low conversations, the occasional glance his way, the ambient performance of people who wanted him to feel like he didn't belong. He let it all run without catching on to any of it. He had learned to do that, too. He thought about the briefing documents instead, the fever clusters, the timeline of symptom onset, the detail that had struck him most that the local clinic had logged 3 separate cases within 6 hours of each other, all from different parts of the same valley, which suggested a shared environmental source rather than person-to-person transmission. That narrowed the variables considerably. It also meant that if the source was identified, quickly containment was genuinely possible. That was the part worth holding on to. Not this lounge, not this woman, not the man with the watch who had already turned away and was now scrolling his phone with the satisfied expression of someone who had already forgotten Marcus existed. Vanessa came back to the desk. She didn't look at Marcus directly. She looked past him toward the tarmac glass, which told him she'd made the call and gotten an answer she hadn't expected. She hadn't yet decided what to do with that answer. She opened her mouth to say something. That was when the sound came. The sound came before the aircraft was visible. It was a low pressurized growl that moved through the glass and into the floor, the kind of vibration that didn't ask permission before it entered a room. Everyone in the lounge felt it. A few people looked up from their phones. The man with the thick watch turned toward the window. But none of that happened yet, because Vanessa had just opened her mouth to speak, and what she said next had nothing to do with the manifest she had allegedly gone to check. She said the terminal was a restricted environment, and that she had the right to ask any individual to leave if they couldn't provide adequate verification of their booking. She said it carefully in the tone of someone reading from an internal policy document they'd memorized specifically for situations like this. She did not mention what she had found or hadn't found when she made the call to operations. She did not mention the tail number Marcus had given her. She simply leaned on the word restricted and waited for it to do the work she wanted it to do. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He said he had provided verification: his name, his booking reference, the tail number of the aircraft. He said he had asked her to check the manifest, and she had gone to do exactly that. He asked what operations had told her. Vanessa said operations was still confirming. Marcus said that was fine, and that he would wait for them to finish confirming. He didn't move. The man with the thick watch, whose name was apparently something like Greg or Brad, the kind of man who introduced himself with a firm handshake and expected you to remember, had been watching this exchange with the relaxed interest of someone watching a minor inconvenience unfold at a comfortable distance. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly, as though the situation had finally earned a more active form of attention. "You know," the man said, not quite to Marcus and not quite to Vanessa, but occupying the space between them in a way that was clearly intentional. "Some people see a door and just walk through it. Doesn't mean they were supposed to." He smiled when he said it. It was a generous smile, the kind that assumed everyone in the room would naturally align with his perspective. A woman near the window, dark blazer, large sunglasses pushed up on her head, made a soft sound of agreement. She didn't look up from her phone. She didn't need to look at Marcus to signal that she found him tedious. That particular skill, the ability to dismiss someone while pretending to ignore them, required no eye contact at all. Vanessa turned back to her desk. She picked up the radio again, this time more deliberately making it visible. She said something into it that Marcus couldn't fully hear, but the body language was clear she was escalating. Not to resolve the situation in his favor, to resolve it in the direction she had already chosen when he first walked through the door. A minute later, a man in a Navy uniform appeared from a side corridor, airport security, mid-50s, the cautious posture of someone who had been called into these situations often enough to know they were usually less serious than reported. He looked at Marcus, then at Vanessa, then at the lounge in general, taking inventory. Vanessa said there was a gentleman who had entered the restricted terminal without proper verification and was refusing to leave. The security officer looked at Marcus and asked if there was a problem. Marcus said there wasn't a problem on his end. He explained concisely that he had a chartered flight scheduled for departure within the hour that he had provided his confirmation email and the aircraft's tail number, and that he was waiting for the gate agent to verify his booking against the manifest. He said he was not causing a disturbance and had no intention of leaving until the verification was complete, because the flight was time-sensitive. The security officer looked at Vanessa. He asked whether the manifest had been checked. Vanessa said operations was still confirming. The way she said it the second time had a different texture than the first, slightly harder, slightly faster, the way words sound when the person saying them has begun to feel the floor shift slightly under their position. The security officer turned back to Marcus and said that in the meantime, it might be easier for everyone if Marcus waited just outside the lounge entrance while the verification was completed. Marcus said he understood the suggestion. He also said that the departure window was closing and that stepping outside created a real risk of missing it, which would delay a medical response that people in the field were depending on. He said this without drama, the way he said most things, as a statement of logistics rather than an appeal to sympathy. He wasn't asking anyone to feel sorry for him. He was giving them the functional facts. The security officer looked uncomfortable in the specific way that people look when they realize the situation they've walked into is less straightforward than the person who called them made it sound. He looked at Vanessa again. Vanessa looked at her desk. The man with the thick watch made a low sound, something between a scoff and a laugh, and said to the woman beside him that this was exactly why they needed better screening at the entrance. The woman agreed without inflection. Somewhere behind Marcus, someone else muttered something about how the lounge used to be better managed. Marcus heard it. He registered it. He filed it in the same category as everything else in this room that wasn't the aircraft manifest or the departure clock, which was to say irrelevant to what he was actually doing with his afternoon. He was about to say something to the security officer, something measured, something that would push the situation toward resolution without escalating it, when the sound hit. It came through the floor first, then the glass. Then the air itself seemed to reorganize around it, a deep sustained roar that was unmistakably a jet engine at close range on final approach. Everyone in the lounge turned toward the tarmac windows. The white aircraft was visible now, descending in a clean line landing gear, down moving with the quiet authority of something that didn't need permission to arrive. It touched down with precision. The engines reversed in a controlled wash of sound. The aircraft slowed, taxied, and came to a stop directly in front of the terminal's tarmac-facing glass, close enough that the tail number was legible from where Marcus was standing. It was the same number he had given Vanessa from memory 20 minutes ago. The radio on Vanessa's desk crackled. Private charter tail number confirmed arriving for Dr. Marcus Hale, requesting immediate boarding preparation. Departure is time critical. Repeat immediate boarding for Dr. Marcus Hale. The lounge went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has just made everyone aware of exactly how much they were wrong. It wasn't a dramatic silence. It was the specific, dense quiet of recalibration of several people simultaneously revising what they thought they understood about the last 20 minutes. Vanessa's hand was resting on the edge of the desk. She didn't move it. She was looking at the aircraft outside, then at the radio, then at Marcus, and the progression of those three looks told the story of someone watching their certainty dismantle itself in real time. The security officer took a single step back the way people do when they suddenly understand that their presence in a situation is no longer relevant. The man with the thick watch said nothing. He looked at his phone. The woman in the dark blazer looked at the tarmac and then at her own hands. The low conversation that had been running as background noise for the past 20 minutes simply stopped, as though someone had found the source of it and turned it off. Vanessa straightened. She set the radio down. She looked at Marcus with an expression that had shed everything it had been carrying, the certainty, the practiced composure. The wall and what was left underneath was considerably less comfortable. She said his name. Dr. Hale. She said she was sorry for the confusion, that there must have been a miscommunication in the system, and that she would escort him to the boarding door immediately. She moved out from behind the desk. She gestured toward the corridor that led to the tarmac exit. She said they needed to move quickly given the departure schedule. She was doing everything correctly now, efficiently, with the snapped professionalism of someone trying to compress the gap between how they had behaved and how they should have behaved by simply moving fast through the procedural steps. Marcus picked up his duffel. He slung it over his shoulder. He looked at the aircraft outside, the crew visible through the cockpit glass, the ground staff already positioning at the steps, and he calculated that he still had enough time barely to make the window. He followed Vanessa 2 steps toward the corridor. Then he stopped. Not because he was angry, not because he wanted an audience, though the lounge was still watching. He stopped because there was something that needed to be said, and there was no version of leaving without saying it that felt like honesty. He turned to face Vanessa. She turned back, expecting a question about boarding logistics or a final documentation request. Her expression was still in recovery mode, ready to assist, ready to correct, ready to move forward without looking back. Marcus spoke quietly. He wasn't addressing the room. He was addressing her. "You don't need to apologize for the airplane," he said. "You need to apologize for deciding what a person is worth before you ask them a single question. The jet is irrelevant. What you did before it landed, that's what matters." He didn't say it harshly. He said it the way he said things when he meant them, completely without decoration, without the softening that turns honesty into something more comfortable, but less true. He looked at her long enough to make sure she had heard it, not just processed the words, but understood the weight of them, and then he turned and walked toward the corridor and the door and the aircraft, waiting on the other side of the glass. The lounge stayed quiet. Vanessa stood where Marcus had left her at the edge of the corridor entrance, one hand still half raised in the direction she'd been about to lead him. The man with the thick watch was no longer looking at his phone. The woman by the window had taken her sunglasses off her head and was holding them in both hands, studying them. No one in the room had anything to add to what had just been said. There was nothing to add. The statement had been exact, the kind that doesn't leave room for rebuttal, not because it was combative, but because it was simply correct. Outside, the jet engine held its low idle as Marcus crossed the tarmac. The aircraft climbed fast and leveled out above the cloud line within minutes. Marcus was the only passenger. The interior was configured for utility rather than comfort. 4 seats, a fold-out table, a medical supply case strapped to the rear bulkhead that the coalition had preloaded before departure. He opened his laptop before they reached cruising altitude and pulled up the field report that had been updated an hour earlier. The numbers had moved. 19 confirmed cases, up from 12 at the time of his initial briefing. 3 individuals had been transferred to a regional hospital 2 hours south, but the road conditions made that route unreliable for volume. The local clinic at the outbreak site had 1 physician on rotation and 2 nurses. They were doing everything correctly, and it wasn't enough. Marcus read the symptom timeline again. Fever onset between 6 and 14 hours. Gastrointestinal involvement in roughly 70% of cases. No respiratory component reported. No confirmed transmission between individuals who hadn't shared a physical location. That last detail was the one that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the 2 a.m. briefing, and it still held up under re-examination. This wasn't moving person to person. It was moving through something that people were sharing, something environmental, something site-specific. The valley geography was a factor. The water table in mountain communities often drew from a single source, filtrated through aging infrastructure that hadn't been inspected in years. He had seen this pattern before in 2 different countries, and both times the source had been found within the first day of on-the-ground assessment. He closed the laptop and looked out the small oval window. The landscape below had shifted from flat urban sprawl to the folded green geometry of mountain terrain ridges running in long parallel lines. Valleys, dark between them. No visible roads at the altitude he was watching from. Somewhere down there, people were spiking fevers and not understanding why, and the people tasked with explaining it to them were running out of answers. That was the part Marcus carried with him on every flight. Like this one, not the complexity of the medical problem, which was usually solvable, but the specific weight of people waiting for an explanation that hadn't arrived yet. Uncertainty had its own kind of damage. It sat alongside the physical symptoms and made everything worse. The aircraft landed on a short airstrip that had clearly been built for agricultural supply runs rather than medical charters. A truck was waiting at the edge of the tarmac. The driver, a broad-shouldered man named Dale, who worked logistics for the Coalition's regional office, had the engine running before Marcus reached the bottom of the aircraft steps. They drove for 40 minutes on a road that alternated between gravel and packed dirt, moving deeper into the valley as the light dropped toward late afternoon gold. Dale gave him the updated briefing on the drive. The clinic was at capacity. The regional hospital had stopped accepting transfers because the road had washed out in 2 places after a heavy rain the previous night. The community's water system was a closed-loop filtration setup that had been installed roughly 22 years ago and had last been formally inspected 6 years before that. The filtration components were still running, but nobody had been able to confirm the integrity of the system's inner housing. Dale said. The clinic's physician, a general practitioner named Dr. Reed, who had been working that valley for 9 years, had already flagged the water supply as a possible concern, but didn't have the equipment or the testing resources to investigate it properly. Marcus asked how many households were on the shared supply line. Dale said approximately 90% of the valley's permanent residents. Marcus said that was the source. He said it before they arrived, before he had run a single test, because the epidemiological profile had been pointing at it for hours, and there was no longer any reasonable alternative. Dale glanced at him from the driver's seat, not skeptically, but with the cautious look of someone who had seen enough false certainties in crisis situations to know that confidence wasn't always the same as accuracy. Marcus told him to get water samples from the filtration output and from at least 3 separate residential taps before they reached the clinic. Dale made 2 calls on his radio and had the sample collection arranged by the time they pulled up to a low, flat-roofed building with a hand-painted sign and a generator running loud behind it. Dr. Reed met them at the door. She was a lean woman in her late 40s, with the specific kind of tired that didn't come from a single long shift, but from a succession of them, the accumulated weight of days rather than hours. She shook Marcus's hand and gave him the case files without preamble, which he appreciated. He didn't need to be welcomed. He needed to work. They went through the files together at a folding table in the back of the clinic, standing because there weren't enough chairs, and sitting down felt like it would cost time neither of them had. The symptom profiles were consistent across cases. The timeline mapping showed a clear cluster. The first 3 cases had presented within 6 hours of each other, from households in the lower section of the valley, where the filtration output line ran first before cycling upward. That distribution wasn't random. It was sequential, which meant the contamination had an entry point and was moving through the supply line in a traceable direction. 2 hours after Marcus arrived, the water samples came back from a mobile testing unit the coalition had pre-positioned in the region. The filtration housing had a fractured inner membrane, a slow structural failure that had been allowing particulate bacterial contamination to bypass the filtration stage and enter the supply line. The bacteria identified was one Marcus had isolated in field conditions twice before. It was treatable. More importantly, it was containable because the source was fixed infrastructure rather than a moving biological agent. He and Dr. Reed worked through the night. Marcus drafted the containment protocol, while Dr. Reed coordinated with the regional health office to get the water supply shut down and replacement resources trucked in by morning. They treated the active cases with the appropriate antibiotic course and established a monitoring schedule for households on the supply line that hadn't yet presented symptoms. Dale's team worked the logistics water distribution household notification coordination with the 2 nurses who had been running on rotation for the past 36 hours and needed to be relieved by morning. By 4 in the morning, the last new case had been logged. No new presentations after that point. By 6, the water supply had been formally isolated, and the contaminated filtration components had been removed and bagged for disposal. By 8, replacement water had arrived by convoy and was being distributed through the valley. Marcus sat on the clinic's front step when it was done. The mountain air was cold and very clean, and the light coming over the eastern ridge was the pale, specific color of early morning at altitude. He was running on no sleep, and the particular kind of steady focus that comes after a long stretch of sustained urgency has finally resolved into stillness. His hands were tired. His eyes were tired. The rest of him was running on something else, not adrenaline exactly. More like the quiet satisfaction of a variable that had been solved. The outbreak was contained. Not because of any single extraordinary act, but because someone had been there to ask the right questions in the right sequence and stay at the table long enough to see them answered. Dr. Reed came out and handed him a cup of coffee. She sat beside him on the step, and they didn't say much for a while, which was the right call. There wasn't a version of that moment that needed words to justify it. He flew back 3 days later, after the monitoring period confirmed no new cases and the regional health office had taken over the ongoing response. The coalition debriefed him by phone during the return flight. The report would document the identified source, the treatment outcomes, and the recommended infrastructure assessment protocol for other communities using similar filtration systems of the same age and type. It was the kind of report that would get filed and referenced and possibly prevent the same event from occurring somewhere else, which was in Marcus's estimation the most useful thing a report could do. He landed at the same private terminal at late afternoon, almost exactly matching the hour he had left it. The tarmac looked the same. The terminal building looked the same. He came down the aircraft steps carrying his duffel, the same carabiner clip on the zipper, pulled the same jacket. Vanessa Cole was standing near the entrance. She wasn't there in a professional capacity. She was standing slightly to the side of the entrance, rather than behind the desk, positioned the way a person positions themselves when they're not sure they have the right to stand where they'd normally stand. She was in her uniform, but she had the posture of someone who had thought carefully about whether to be there at all and had decided to come anyway, which required its own kind of commitment. She said his name when she saw him, Dr. Hale. She said she had checked the return flight manifest, and she wanted to be here when he landed, and she knew that wasn't standard procedure, and she understood if he didn't want to have this conversation. Marcus stopped. He set his duffel down on the ground beside him and looked at her. Vanessa said she had been thinking about what he had said before he boarded. Not about the aircraft, not about the manifest. About the other part, the part about deciding what a person was worth before asking them a single question. She said she had run through the events of that afternoon many times in the days since, and there was no version of it where her behavior reflected who she wanted to be. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly without the hedging language people often use when they want to apologize, without fully occupying the apology. Marcus listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't rush her toward the end of it. When she finished, he picked up his duffel. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't warm exactly, but wasn't closed off either, the expression of someone who had decided honesty was more useful than performance. He told her that he accepted the apology. Then he said one more thing because it was true, and because she seemed like someone who would actually use it, rather than just absorb it as a lesson and put it away somewhere. Not everyone who walks through that door is looking for something expensive, he said. Some of them are just passing through on the way to somewhere that needs them. You can't see that by looking at a jacket. You can only see it by asking. Vanessa nodded. She didn't say anything else, which was the right response, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some things settle better in silence than in language. Marcus walked through the terminal and out to the cab line on the other side. The afternoon light was low and flat, the same color it had been when he'd landed the same city, moving at its same pace around the airport perimeter. He got into a cab, put his duffel on the seat beside him, and gave the driver his address. He didn't think about the lounge or the aircraft or the conversation at the door. He thought about the valley, about Dr. Reed's specific kind of tired, about the contaminated membrane in the filtration housing, and how long it might have been failing before anyone was in a position to notice. He thought about the people who had been sick and were now recovering, and about the ones downstream in other valleys with the same aging infrastructure who didn't know yet that what had happened here was coming for them next if nobody went to check. There was work still to do. There was always work still to do. That had been true for 11 years and showed no sign of changing, which, if he was being straightforward with himself, was precisely why he kept doing it. He watched the city pass outside the cab window and let himself be tired for the first time in days.